Thick descriptions disrupts traditional educational methods. And why do we do that? Because we want to help humans thrive where they are, building better communities. One way that we do that is the Elephant in the Room Unboxed, where we give our audience members the tools and the resources to have those uncomfortable conversations and do it in a humane and anthropological way. We're doing this in partnership with Respect Diversity, another organization that is committed to doing the work with us. Each episode will have a different host and a different guest talking about uncomfortable conversations or uncomfortable topics and giving you the resources of how to navigate them. Let's get uncomfortable.
Hello, and welcome to Elephant in the Room Unboxed. My name is Veda Pai, and I'm currently a graduate student at the University of Oklahoma. Today, our guest is Helidth Ravenholm. Helidth is the founder of Culture Contact, a consultation service for businesses and non-governmental organizations wishing to bring inclusiveness into the workplace and to strengthen interpersonal relationships via anthropological methods. Her work does not end there, however, with her work ranging from crime, human behavior, and AI, and heritage work. In a specialized approach to anthropology, Helidth brings a refreshing sense of understanding and empathy when interacting with businesses. Through anthropology, she has created a unique place for human interaction to be understood and questioned. As a budding anthropologist myself, with focuses on gender, race, and inequity in modern spaces, this conversation is a look into how society perpetuates problematic norms and how the use of anthropology can illuminate biases to put equity in the forefront. But first, let's understand the basics of what anthropology means for Helidth as a consultant. Traditionally, many anthropologists are bound within the constraints of academia, which comes with several norms and structures. While that can be beneficial, it is interesting to see how anthropology is used at a ground level, such as interpersonal relationships within the workplace. First, Helidth, let's understand how you came upon this work and used the methods of anthropology independently from academia.
Well, hi, it's great to be here. That's quite an interesting question. For me, this started during field work, so terrain work, when I realized that my informant actually felt that they had something to glean from my perspective as well. So it became a reciprocal relationship, if you want. And from there, obviously, I started looking at how this could be applied otherwise. And thus, Culture Contact was born.
Wow, that's awesome. We've already spoken about my interests in independent anthropology, but I really want to know what values you lead with at Culture Contact, because I find that a values-led approach is always the best way to really relate to people, especially with difficult conversations such as race and privilege and, discursive spaces.
To be completely honest with you and with our listeners, I guard myself actually from applying the word values. And there's a really good reason for that. It's not weird, it's not creepy, I promise. At least it's good from where I'm standing. And it's the following. We put a lot of social meaning into the word value, while claiming the meaning is going to be equal, completely understood by everyone. So if I unpack that for a moment in actual context, we can have people claiming their values make them support human rights, or only the rights as they understand them, or only certain human rights, or only human rights for certain people, or rights they feel should be entitled to, regardless of what they mean for others. Or they may sort of say that they do not support human rights at all because of their values. So, this is a hugely differing context from, one understanding to another. And yet we use the one word and we claim it's all the same. So this doesn't only pervade our society right now, it has existed in the past, has a certain amount of continuity. And obviously how this plays out in practice in everyday context depends on the era, on circumstances, the intensity of emotion, and the affect involved. So affect, for anyone who isn't an anthropologist or sociologist, in a nutshell, would be the way emotions are aroused about a specific topic that may not, I would say, actually factually touch us personally. And obviously, I'm just fresh from a 2-day conference that was big on that. So I can, actually include this. So to return to the question, I guard myself from speaking about values. Today, when we discuss values, what we are really doing very often is trying to figure out who sounds like they will tell us what we want to hear. And obviously, as a consultant, I really want to avoid doing that.
Right. Yeah.
What I offer is far more plain and blunt, I guess. I offer to use my knowledge in a way that will enable the client to gain insight into what they are going through or what might be at play in a broader context. So it's like no more, no less, because in the end, all talk about lasting change can be also misleading. I can bend over backwards. And I know this because I've done this. And yet 3 months down the line, 5 months down the line, something will change. Maybe a team member will arrive or leadership will change. Society will clash over another thing. The results of my work with a client will change, obviously, because of that too. So because unlike what we tend to think, the world is always changing. Mm-hmm. And that means social and cultural challenges repeat and shift too. So what I try to give, I suppose, is tools, if you want. I want them to see culture, see society. That this is like very Avatar style, right? I want them to totally. I always see like I see you, right? I want them to be able to understand why we do things the way we do. They are not cast in stone, but a matter of introspection, awareness, with 1,000 actions. More importantly, I do have a list of things I will not do and a list of clients I will not work for unless they were to approach me with a very specific request. So just attempting to make a very positive change in a way I can actually trust they're going to really go through with. Yeah. So I suppose if we try to go for a flashy, condensed statement, I lead with facts. I lead with investigation. I lead with teaching people how to learn to see who humans really are. And the part of that obviously is empathy. Mm-hmm. And I expect we'll come to that a bit more later because empathy, interestingly, while it shouldn't be, is also about an us and them division in a lot of ways. And I hope that actually answers it.
Yeah, I mean, that's so fascinating. Just understanding, I think the discrepancies in how you differentiate values is very particular because I feel like as anthropologists, we use values a lot. And for me, I'm a former peer educator. And so leading with values during, possible defensive conversations was a huge thing in my training. And shifting that now as I've moved through academia and through my research is, I think there might be a different word for possibly what you're trying to lead with, not you specifically, but in general, when you're leading difficult conversations. But I think the truth and the honesty and the empathy portion is huge because I'm doing very intense work. I mean, you probably understand this about reproduction and health in Oklahoma with Indigenous women, and to not lead with empathy there is to sort of discredit a lot of experiences. While I may not agree with my own political affiliation, there are context-specific pieces that need to be understood. So
absolutely.
When I was crafting this interview, I was really going deep into my own understanding of how I function as a researcher. So,
well, that's really good because it really gives us an option to look at, in a way, how we differ in this and what we can learn from that. And I think that's actually really why we need to have these conversations.
Right. Yeah. And then separate from being an anthropologist, I feel like as a human being having these conversations in the political world is, I have other questions about that later, but when you deal with people specifically who are like, oh, I can't talk to Uncle George about his racist tendencies because I don't want to get him defensive, or I don't want to, it's too uncomfortable for me. But I think it's so fascinating to see how leading with empathy and leading with truth can actually help in that process. And also when using truth as a mechanism of change, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a negative sort of call out statement in the ways that I've understood it. But you may disagree, but I'm just thinking broadly about all this stuff. So I love that you use the word tools rather than values. I really love that imagining. So my second question sort of goes along with that, where it says, how have you dealt with particularly clashing views within personal relationships? For example, positions of ethnocentrism and cultural bias is incredibly prevalent, but largely unrecognized. And for clarification, so the meaning of ethnocentrism is the belief that one's culture is superior towards another, so much so that it imparts judgment on an opposing or a different culture. it's not just the pride in one's culture, but superiority and the inferiority of another culture. So that's just a definition that I wanted to clarify. So yeah, how do you deal with those clashing views when you're working with a business or you're trying to mediate interpersonal relationships?
Well, first of all, I try to approach with fresh eyes. I actually always ask myself in a situation, am I actually dealing, what is actually fueling this? Am I actually dealing with ethnocentrism or cultural bias or not? Because you will have people who have what I have actually seen cases, for instance, where someone was reacting to a bad memory from something. Obviously, this is so much more difficult. If I could just tell you specific cases, right? Actually, but I can't because so we're gonna be nebulous here. So yeah, I mean, for instance, if you're actually looking at people who have had legitimate fears in their lives from legitimate experiences, and that obviously will absolutely influence how they view others, or how they did. I mean, I've seen trauma from war, trauma from assaults, and so on. Sometimes there's shared trauma, much like you see with the Black community, the US Jewish community, and honestly I would say with other communities, including the LGBT, has not been given necessarily as much spotlight for various reasons in the current debates on shared trauma. So basically you always have to check, okay, fine, it looks like, but is it also, if we go for the old saying, it quacks like a duck, right? Does it actually quack like a duck? And in that case, you have to actually look, okay, fine, this person seems to be having a problem with a specific, I don't know, team member or whoever, or maybe they have had a bad influence from an event that's making them feel something about, for instance, crime in a specific neighborhood. So I always have to see, okay, fine, am I dealing with a personal trauma? Or am I actually dealing with, shall we say, group held beliefs, right? And that in itself is already going to shift how I'm going to approach it. And obviously, whatever I do, and obviously, I actually picked that method from a forensic course, I think it was from Strathclyde, that I took years back. I always go with the 6 W's and ABC. So who, what, why, how, when, where. Accept nothing, believe no, and check everything, right? Basically, what I try to do is I try to very gently, because obviously you have to be gentle, because in a lot of cases, if you are dealing with someone's trauma, right, these are going to be incredibly painful things that they may not really want to discuss with anybody. And the last person you want to discuss this with is, like some anthropological consultant who popped up because your boss doesn't think that you get along with other people well enough. But seriously, I mean, if you think about it, put yourself in their shoes, right? It's like, what would you feel? For instance, in cases, for instance, of even multiple traumas. I mean, if I take, for instance, I did research quite a lot down in ex-Yugoslavia, and you'll have, for instance, women who have dealt with murders, with scarcity, with war itself as a trauma, with rapes. And then if you think about it, maybe even if they migrate, they're going to potentially be dealing with someone from a similar background. This is going to open a floodgate, right? And the same is true for so many other people. So, okay, fine. Yeah, okay, maybe you don't get along with X, Y, Z, but the question is why? Always, always why? Always. Yeah. I suppose this is where empathy really kind of plays in. It's like always start from the I don't know your story, right? Mm. And obviously, we have to consider that group held beliefs, whether they are based on facts or factoids or nothing at all, they also can have a very strong influence on us because they are a part of our identity, right? So basically, again, even if I will turn around and say, oh, okay, fine, there is no horrible story. This is actually just bias. Right. I have to consider that this person may feel very touchy, to put it that way, about having to face the fact that what they've been taught, and you don't forget that basically what we are taught, we are usually taught about people we trust, right? We are taught about people we love, Right. And very often, unfortunately, people we love, especially older generations who have had the time to essentially live in the time of some pretty bad historic facts may have actually been observers, perpetrators. Maybe they looked the other way. Maybe they're victims of them. So all this is going to actually influence how somebody feels about something and how personal it feels. So this is how I always start, and obviously find this whether or not I'm going to get what kind of result I can actually hope for, whether or not I'm going to get into one approach and another. That really just does depend on what I'm actually dealing with. So I know this is not a very good answer, but it's probably the best answer unless we go into specific cases.
It goes so much into what, like for me, I'm in sociocultural anthropology, and I am going to jump to a little bit of another question, another topic that I feel connects to this great is, so I'm currently in an anthropology of human rights class, and we are learning about the position of anthropology within international human rights framework, and how anthropology has critiqued or either added to the conversation. And there's oftentimes a lot of critique of anthropology not being applicable to human rights frameworks because of the act of cultural relativism. So for listeners out there, cultural relativism is the placing of like cultural context in the understanding of whatever cultural situation you're going into. So for discussing the use of a specific item of clothing, rather than placing it in a bias of somebody who might not understand, you're placing it in the social context of that culture. For example, the use of hijab, from an outsider perspective, it may be seen as oppressive or weird, but for some women and for some hijabi women, it is a form of expressing their modesty, expressing their womanhood as a way that's incredibly freeing. And so placing that in context is incredibly important to understand the broader meaning of that clothing. So that is just an example of cultural relativism. But in terms of human rights, there's a concept of critical cultural relativism, which sort of takes that context understanding like you were talking about earlier, but also allows for critiques to happen. It's not just like a blanket acceptance of whatever's happening. It's more rather a removal of one's own bias in determining like if something's unethical or problematic, and placing like the actual context into whether or not human rights violations have occurred. I've been trying to lead with that because the work I'm doing can be really, really politically charged. And I'm working specifically on cases of abortion and, reproductive politics in Indigenous spaces. And, a lot of people have a lot of different experiences and opinions about that. And as somebody who has a particular opinion, it's really easy to go into that situation when I'm doing the research and sort of judge that based on my own assumptions. And as I've gone through all these processes, I'm like, hold on, wait, there's a reason for why they may or may not support abortion or the termination of a pregnancy, because, you were talking about trauma and like, that has huge play into why people may or may not agree with that. So leading with that is huge. You sort of answered my question, but how has the critical cultural relativistic approach allowed you to lead with empathy, but not passiveness in the situations of tension?
Well, I want to get one thing straight first. Terming culture relative is actually heavily based on colonial thinking. And I'm going to tell you why. This is going to be another one of those really horrible moments, because there is nothing relative about pain. There's nothing relative about oppression. If we consider culture from the old-fashioned perspective, that everything has a reason, not only, we actually still get that if you think about it, everything happens for a reason. And I've heard a lot of victims get really angry about that. In a way, it's toxic positivity, right? So not only do we end up forgetting that culture is not monolithic, it's not cast in stone, it's generally, unless it's like in heavily rigid context where all diversity is banned, those not going with it are destroyed, a mix of at least slightly differing behaviors, or at least, slightly diverse populace situations that shift through time and space. In really simple terms, when in 19th and 20th century, white Western anthropologists tried to do their best or worst to understand cultures, they brought in an idea that culture was monolithic, or at least that the so-called primitive cultures were. Obviously, we're using the term here educationally, whether they consider that good or bad. And this essentially means that culture is reduced to what at a specific time someone says it is, which we know so far is basically really not true from everything that we've looked at. And all cultures, all societies generally experience change all the time to some extent. So when we approach cultures as relative, we are in a lot of danger of doing the following. We're casting in stone the culture as it is at the moment or at a moment in time, and how we, or the writer, if you want, sees it, which is technically biased, casting in stone how our informants see it, regardless of what their motives might be. And obviously, I would like to point out that informants can have bias. Enabling, because obviously bullying, gratification through violence or sexual violence, discrimination, and so on, all comes with that, because there are always reasons that may go unchecked because there is no recourse for the victims. And obviously, through doing that, we're silencing the victims' voices and disabling any attempt at change. So I think from this, I've got like a very weird, an uncomfortable relationship, I suppose, with cultural relativism. What I suggest people to do is a certain amount of cultural awareness and a great amount of curiosity and empathy, if you want, cultural empathy, that should not at any point end up in abuse of human rights and in silencing of victims. And I'm going to be really horrible now, but the argument of you just don't understand our culture has been used by abusive powers when perpetrating genocide because someone else has been endangering them, right? Or when discriminating against religion, because this is, I'm going to say like Muslim or Christian or Buddhist country, when discriminating against gender, because in this specific culture, it's a must for women or men to undergo something that they may not want to undergo, but have no choice because of the rigid context of the culture in question. And obviously, when I'm talking about that, I mean, choice is something that comes with the freedom to decide what I am going to do, whether or not, say, for instance, if I take hijab, right? Some women find hijab freeing, but they should have the right to decide to do so. And when I talk about consequences, right, there should be no pressure from the family, no threats, et cetera, no issues with employment, which we do know sometimes actually does happen. And again, this is not about Muslims. This happens to everybody. But this is just an example because you actually talked about, and obviously with the war in Iran, I think it's practically war at this point. I think it is actually important to consider that as well. And obviously, very loudly, this type of behavior has been going against sexual minorities. I have literally had to hold my stomach in a few times in the past few years when researching hate crimes in cultures where, and I will quote now, gays don't exist. And obviously, that means that you can do horrible things to them. So we should definitely be worried about bias, absolutely. But do we ever ask ourselves whether we are worried about a very dark type of positive bias when a researcher is trying to look culturally aware or very simply just adopts a culture for some reason and they're defining something as a horrific practices as an essential cultural practice to look good? Do we ever ask ourselves about our own implicit bias when we supposedly, like, quote unquote, understand the perpetrators and ending up silencing victims? And obviously those victims may represent something that we too have a history of repressing in our own culture. So it's kind of, this can go so hot, so hard, so dark.
No, it's very, that's the thing that I've been sort of wrapping my brain around and having these conversations with my peers and my professors is that, like, I personally don't think that cultural relativism is exactly the correct term, and like critical cultural relativism is the exact right term to use in this case, especially with dealing with something as severe as human rights violations.
Absolutely.
It's kind of hard to explain, but it's just sort of you do need context to understand the political and social history that has brought the victims and the survivors up until this point, but you don't want it to be a position of blame, of shame, of
absolutely. Go
and,
back to the whole idea of empathic approach of compassion when we deal with this.
I've sort of coined in my own sort of understanding of all this process and trying to impart that on myself of possibly cultural critical context, 3C.
Oh, I like that. I love that. That I'm going to steal that. Okay, I'm going to borrow that. I never
cite me for it. But
No, but this is actually a really, really good term. And I think you should popularize it.
Yeah,
so I can definitely borrow it because, no, this is actually something that I think we often lack words and terms. And very often what in this is like true of all sciences, we're building on accidental or otherwise prejudices of everybody before us. And unfortunately, that comes with a cost.
Right.
And unless we address that cost, and again, like no anger, no rancor, no whatever, just basically observing whether or not, and this is something I actually learned through business. In business versus academia, you look at an idea and you figure out if it works. If it serves you, then you basically go with it. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Unfortunately, in academia, and this is something that I think academics have a lot more trouble struggling with because of, in a way, the peer pressure. There's always this, well, I'm going to defend I've got my theory, and it doesn't matter if it's actually applicable. It's a theory, and therefore it is valid, and I'm going to defend it to my death. And basically, that, unfortunately, that doesn't go anywhere. That doesn't go anywhere.
No, I mean, it's just crazy to think about. I have so many opinions on academia and all.
Same.
But that's not really what we're talking about here. But I think critical cultural context is sort of a term that I've used to combat, because I see the validity in critiquing cultural relativism from a standpoint. It's incredibly valid. And I think from the history of anthropology, it is completely valid considering all of the colonial structures in place and how anthropology has contributed to that.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of understanding how to proceed with human rights violations, it's not as simple as just applying the United Declaration of Human Rights. It is required.
If it only was.
If it was, we would live in a perfect world. But it requires a sort of an understanding of how colonialism and settlership and history and economic forces have played into how this has gotten to be so bad. That doesn't mean that if you reverse like capitalism, it's going to change, but it means that you have to understand that background in order to proceed. You cannot just apply a universal concept, which is I think I am trying to put across for our listeners. Is like, it's not as simple, not just in the context of human rights, but like when you're dealing with these hard conversations, it's not as simple as just telling somebody, oh, you're racist, oh, you're sexist, oh, whatever.
Absolutely. I would really use this moment to caution against this, because this is that approach where essentially you're essentially not trying to solve anything. You're essentially just looking for a fight. Yeah. And I'm going to be very blunt about this because honestly, you know how it is. Like when you work for yourself, you don't really care who hates you. But honestly, those are really real problems. And if we want to solve them, we need discussions, we need debates, we need understanding with everybody. And you never get that if you're just going to get people defensive. Right.
So. And it's such a fascinating being as now I've been talking to my own family members about biases and their own experiences with discrimination as immigrants or second generation Indian Americans, is I have to learn where they're coming from. I have to learn how they were raised. Like I have conversations with my father, who was raised in the American South during the busing of integration and during the civil rights movement, and understanding his experiences with racism and hateful language, and understanding how he sort of internalized that. And as he's such a good man, but understanding that he has his own biases, and while he may not outright be saying all this horrible stuff, he's, processing that in his own way. And when having these conversations about these big structural changes that are really scary when you're not familiar with it, of course, trying to lead with that. And of course, I'm my father's daughter and we butt heads a lot, but
that's good. That's good.
But I think trying to have those conversations and understanding my parents' history and understanding why they are the way they are is so enlightening as somebody who is really trying to become more socially aware of themselves.
Absolutely.
So just leading with empathy and really trying to I really want to emphasize to all of our listeners that context here is huge, and understanding
Yes.
Context and empathy is huge because in order to have these hard conversations, or if you're trying to have these hard conversations with yourself, because you may not understand the institutions that you were raised in, why you are either afforded or not afforded privileges, or why you are experiencing different things based on parts of your identity. It can be really hard and really difficult to process, but that empathy and that context is really enlightening to sort of progress and help you become a better member of society.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just went on my soapbox there for a second, but
Yeah, I love that. I love that. That's a great thought.
Yeah, I have a couple questions that sort of all overlap. A second question that I think is probably going to be very helpful for people is, you and I have talked about this before, but how do you have hard conversations without letting emotions get in the way? Or is that even possible? Many people find it really difficult to have hard conversations surrounding their own privilege, race, or possible actions of discrimination against others. But when confronted with a hard reality, many can become uncomfortable or defensive, which is really understandable when you're not familiar, or you're feeling sort of like called out or backed into a corner, right? But how do you advise that people let go of their quote unquote ego in a sense and start fresh? Because you deal with this all the time in your clients and the people that you're working with.
Well, absolutely. To be honest, though, very often it doesn't actually pop up so much once you've already approached it. Because most people, they're used to, like they come like a hedgehog, right? Because like all the guard is up and they're so uncertain, or they already, have had bad experiences with someone being very confrontational.
Right.
But when they realize that you're there with compassion, that you're there essentially just trying to discuss things in this like relaxed manner, very often they kind of settle down a bit and it becomes possible to enter these discussions. And I mean, one of the things, for instance, I did when I did a panel, I was part of a panel about LGBT immigrants, was like last year, 2 years ago, at University of Utrecht. Essentially, I asked everybody to imagine if they are blue-eyed, what would happen? This is like there's no significance in the eye color. I just chose an eye color that I don't have. So what would happen if they suddenly outlawed all the blue people, blue-eyed people? What would happen if you weren't allowed to hold the hand of a blue-eyed partner, et cetera, et cetera? And that really, I think, and this is something I do use with my clients, actually. It's a little exercise, and I think it does really let people start to think outside of, this is now going to be a conversation that is actually going to be an argument about something I don't necessarily agree with because I can't agree with it because it's targeting me personally, right? Mm-hmm. It's more about, okay, this could happen to me, right? And what would that make me feel? But obviously, it also depends on what we mean when we say emotions, because I honestly don't think emotions are necessarily so bad, right? We always talk about emotions as something bad, which is technically derived from Victorianism, how they felt they should deal or shouldn't deal with emotion. Right. Where emotion was something this raw, natural, often considered female, childlike, and insane. And obviously, total, very unhealthy control of everything we feel was social/cultural, adult, masculine, sane. But obviously, because we have emotions, period, and others have them too. And so I think showing emotions and allowing others to show those emotions, to live those emotions, I think that could be a good thing. And obviously, fine, we're not necessarily talking about massive anger or impatience here. And fine, obviously, even there, it depends. Does the situation call for expressing anger, and how are we expressing it? Are we talking like throwing chairs, which is so totally not on? Or are we expressing that, yeah, of course something makes us angry because there is a reason. Anger is a human emotion. Right. And yeah, I think the point is respectful anger, if you want. So yeah, I mean, that obviously that takes practice, especially if this is like you as a consultant or a researcher who's feeling that. But I think for others as well, you have to consider that you're going to have to allow for people to practice that themselves, to learn that it's okay to feel this, that it takes introspection to understand why we're angry sometimes.
Right.
I mean, for instance, to like draw on my own experience here as an LGBT person. So I'm married to like the best woman in the world, and I'm very, very biased about this, but I'm gonna fight that. And when I realized that essentially I'm in love with a woman, that felt like a humongous targeting cross all over my back. That was so much, if you want, internalized homophobia. And not quite just homophobia, because it's also realization that, yes, for some people you are a target, right?
Right.
That it felt very personal, especially because there was so much bullying in my life, there's so much violence in my life. And I mean, for instance, I was nearly strangled to death when I was like barely 7. And I still can't actually wear choker necklaces. I just can't. I can wear some sweaters, some turtlenecks, but I just cannot do choker necklaces. And again, if you think about it, that's not really, this is a realization of the fact that we are in fact in danger. So I think it's important to actually separate when we're aware of danger. I think for instance, for Black community, that's very often been the case in the US. And obviously this applies otherwise elsewhere. But it does kind of like raise its ugly head every now and then. For instance, lately with the whole war in Ukraine now, when certain Russian president turned around and blamed the LGBT. This is like literally why we are waging war. And this is a war against LGBT people and the West. And I'm sitting there, I'm telling to my wife, I don't know how I feel about this. I can't process what this means for me. And what I said to her was, I'm going to have to talk to Gran about it, because my grandmother is 100 and she is a war veteran. So basically she understands what it's like. She saw the World War II. She fought in the World War II. She understands this concept a little bit better. So sometimes I think it's very important to remember that we may not be able to process everything, and that we need the time to process it. The emotions may be very confused. They may be coming from all sorts of places. And I think allowing others to do the same is crucial in all these debates.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's really like, we've already had this conversation, you and I, but like these experiences are so formative in understanding how you become who you are. Right. And
absolutely. Absolutely.
I think when you're dealing with, when somebody becomes defensive, sort of having that empathy and understanding, me like allowing them to have that anger, not necessarily responding on the defensive of your own, because when you come to somebody or you're calling them out, not even just about these hard conversations, but if you're having a fight with somebody, it's going to be uncomfortable and it's going to be tough, and sort of allowing that space to be like a sort of a clean slate. I think that's something that I've tried to use in my own life when I'm dealing with sort of like arguments with people that I love. It's not necessarily that relationship is kaput, but the relationship just needs time to heal, because we are all processing things in our own way. And also it's a conversation. It's not a lecture. Okay. I mean, applause, because literally that. Okay. I mean, it's like, I always try to impress upon people. Okay. What is the result that we are aiming for? Right.
Okay.
Right.
So I think that's what we really, really need to consider. What are we aiming for? Are we aiming for being right?
Right.
Or is this a power? It's like, if you want, it's like a relationship, right? Basically, is this about the fact that you're tired and you really, really need protein? Chat with me. It's one of those things. You're tired. You really need a protein shake because it's been a long day. You've done like nothing much. You just had tea or whatever. You just need your protein fix. Did you actually just want the other person to make you a protein shake and cuddle your feet a little and take the trash out because you're too tired to do it? Yeah. Is there an actual problem or what? It has to be about a real solution in the end.
Right. No, I think that's so important. And, we've already had these conversations about empathy and like what is the reason that we're doing this, right? I think at least for me as an anthropologist, it can be so easy to try to fix all these problems in the world because I see something wrong with it. And that's not necessarily my place. It's not necessarily my place to do that. And there's already so many people doing great things. I'm just sort of here to listen, and like, I'm more than willing to sit there and let people talk, because oftentimes I was just talking to a friend about this, where when I was a kid, I used to think that I knew everything and that I was like the smartest person in the world. And now that I'm an adult, I'm like, I don't know anything. I don't know anything. And that's totally fine by me. And that is such an enlightening, like, exciting process for me to like relinquish that, because
I can learn from others.
Exactly. Yeah. And like, I think that's so freeing, because even though I might have a degree or somebody may not have the same whatever, like, that can still be a learning moment. Like, and like, the community is such a amazing thing. So that's just one thing that I was thinking about when we were discussing that. And this next question sort of goes into, we've already sort of addressed this, but how has anthropology and the exposure to possibly unsettling, unfamiliar materials allowed you to analyze your own complicity in broader institutions such as race, class stratification, and socioeconomic boundaries?
Well, it's complicated.
Right. No, I mean,
it's definitely complicated. Because, on one hand, I've definitely grown up in contexts where prejudices were held. I mean, that's a fact, period. We all do. But I think the reason why I became an anthropologist was because I was asking uncomfortable questions. So for me, this journey wasn't the other way around. I am aware of the fact that for a lot of people it is. For instance, I can imagine that this is basically something a lot of us go through when you come across a little tidbit and you're kind of like, oh, wait a minute. I had a little moment like that when I was reading Lupton. I think it was Food, the Body and the Self in the first year. And obviously I started studying as an adult. So I was a bit older than a lot of people. I've seen a lot more. And I was looking at that and I was like, hey, what you're saying here is totally applicable to X, Y, Z, right?
Right. Yeah.
And it just becomes this like big wake up call of, whoa, okay, I've got an answer. I actually found the paragraph that explains it all. But on the other hand, because I asked a lot of questions before, and because to a certain extent I approached this from a slightly older perspective than most students do, I already spotted a lot of things in the actual anthropology itself that I suppose wasn't giving me the answers I was seeking. It was more informing me why I don't agree.
Right.
And I think that is actually really vital, because if we want to, remove bias, including from the science, we have to actually understand that being critical about where someone was coming from, what they were saying, what they were doing, even just understanding and when they're critical, I don't now mean like be mean about it, but just understand their context and what may have actually influenced them already tells me, okay, fine, this works, this doesn't. And obviously this got really refined later on to work on terrain, so field work, and ultimately as a consultant. Yeah. So I'm not sure if that answers the question. I think it's a bit evasive, I suppose. But from my own perspective, for me, I suppose the biggest, hugest wake-up call was actually falling in love with a woman and realizing that basically that made me feel incredibly vulnerable.
Right. Yeah. And I think those moments of vulnerability is it's so scary. Like absolutely. Absolutely. I'm a woman of color. I've lived in the South basically my entire life. I went to a predominantly white institution, and I have a number of other identities that sort of in my position can feel very isolating and very scary.
Oh my God. Yeah.
But I think
absolutely,
at least for me, like my dad and my family, like bless them, they, social media is a thing that can be really scary. But for me, like my age, there's so many great communities out there.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Really allowed for the like creation of belonging, like that has
Yeah.
just been so
Yeah.
amazing, and really understanding that like people have very similar experiences to me, even if we're like completely across the world from each other. And I think
Oh, yes.
like social media specifically has been like Instagram and Twitter and everything has been really amazing in sort of cultivating that belonging for people my age, even if it may get flack from like older generations who, you know, understandably, if they don't have any exposure to it, if you don't understand something unknown can be really, really difficult to grasp.
Yeah. Plus, we only
Especially
ever
with-
really.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, especially with how fast technology moves, like
Oh,
stuff
yeah.
changes every day that like you learn one thing and then it changes the next
Bam,
day.
it's gone
and then-
tomorrow.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So it can be really difficult to understand that. But I think especially in anthropology and like students, like they're really taking advantage of social media to, you know, create these huge political movements that I don't think would have had the power it did without having this sense of community and having people,
Yeah.
no matter where they are,
absolutely.
connect. I think
Absolutely.
that interconnectedness is huge. But yeah, I think that vulnerability can feel really isolating sometimes. And not to say that that isn't present now, but I think that like vulnerability is something that can be really shared and really
Yeah.
empathized with, which I think is really nice to see.
Well,
this sort of-
speaking of social media, I do remember one case, for instance. I mean, first of all, yeah, definitely with older generations, especially because most of the time everybody hears just about what's wrong with social media, right? And I mean, there is a lot wrong with social media. It can be a very scary place, but like you said, there's a lot of community feeling. I mean, I remember one thing, for instance, that kind of sticks in my mind because obviously I am on Instagram, et cetera. And I do remember, even though I'm not that young, right? But I do remember one occasion when someone, an LGBT group, I don't know where they were because they were very cagey about it. I fully understand why. I mean, this is about personal safety, but I'm not even sure if, you know, if they consider themselves male or female or whatever gender, but they definitely said that they are gay and they are basically at death's door. As far as they're concerned, they are suicidal. They can't do this anymore. And they were a teen. And what I actually said, and apparently, this is me actually going from what they told me, apparently literally walked them off the ledge, was that, you know, you could just play that you're like a secret agent. one day you're going to actually manage to get out of that. And apparently that was enough. I mean, I literally, this was the only thing I could think of saying in that particular situation. And I am so grateful that that was the right thing to say.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I think a lot about toxic positivity and sort of all of that stuff that surrounds, especially with mental health.
Yes.
And sort of mental health in marginalized communities can be so, it's so tough to deal with. But I think having that honesty and having that validation of being like, yeah, you're right, this does suck. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Or somebody who is not in your position, an ally, being like, I am here to listen and I am here to
absolutely
be a comfort rather than a lecturer is so refreshing. Like, I think a lot of people my age, at least, you know, everybody has their own opinion, everybody has their own way of dealing with things. But the people that I've sort of met and discussed this stuff with, it's like really refreshing to hear my like white counterparts be like, listen, I'm just going to shut up and I'm just going to listen. And you just talk about whatever. And if I'm just here listening and that's what you get out of conversation, then I'm totally fine with that. And that is such a beautiful thing.
That is
like,
beautiful.
I think listening is a huge, huge tool that like, I think really needs to be cultivated because not many people have that ability, no matter their age. I think it's a very hard thing to sort of active listening to get yourself into. But I think once you learn that, it is so enlightening. And so I keep using that word, but that's just how I feel about all this stuff.
No, but it is very enlightening because it does give us this, and as anthropologists, I think we are very much into that. We love listening to other people anyhow. And I think it does give us this insight into who this other person is. And 3/4 of all the issues in the world, all the hate, all the bias, all the misunderstandings are down to the fact that we do not see the other person as someone who's just very similar to ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think that's so big. Seeing cultural similarities rather than differences. I think that's huge, especially in dealing with all of these like really intense things, whether it be abortion or whether it be, genocide or war, or I think that's huge. And it's a matter of getting the general public, not just, the people in power, to understand that, because that can be really big. But
absolutely.
It's going to be like my last question, because this sort of relates to everything we've talked about. But in an article titled Cultural Indoctrination and Introduction, you and Carol Reed have discussed the topic of indoctrination and the response to stimuli becoming maladaptive. How has this been seen in the public sphere with, for example, people stating that their past possible discriminatory behavior was ingrained in culture? How do you deal with the concept of racism being ingrained but dismissed when called out in a broader culture?
First real article. So that was written together with my wife. We've actually, especially me, because I work more in that whole sphere. This is actually, like grown since then, because, papers are stuck in a moment, but the theory goes on. And how does this apply? First of all, you have to understand that we consider all our responses to be adaptive, but in fact, they are not.
Right.
Under adaptive, I mean adapting to what the situation calls for. For instance, I love to pull out like saber-toothed tigers, because I love saber-toothed tigers. So in the old days, when basically saber-toothed roamed the earth, you could actually meet one, and then you were like, well, that's not good. And you had options, right? Either you froze and you kind of like played invisible, which I don't know how that would work. I suppose it depends where you were. Or you could fight, you could go for running or whatever, climbing a tree. I have no idea if they climb, so I have no idea whether or not that would be a good response. But basically, those are kind of like these clear responses to clear stimuli from the environment. And fine, in an argument, for instance, you can actually go for appeasement. So there's like, these options that we have to deal with a specific situation. But as we know from mental health issues, not all reactions are necessarily reactions that serve a purpose.
Right.
So basically what happens is we can develop and internalize and group share, if you want, specific behaviors that really, really don't work well. And actually, this is something hilariously that I do work with a lot since the pandemic has started, not in any racial situation, for instance, but because of supply chains. This is really funny in a way, because it's such a departure from, like all the really serious, but how it is when you're an anthropologist, you deal with a lot of stuff. And one of the things that I've been meeting with constantly in my work at this point is when supply chains did what the supply chains did, and it wasn't all reliable, and you could try to talk to a colleague across the world, and then basically they could try and send stuff, but it wasn't working, as we know. A lot of people just went into this kind of, I don't know, fugue state of, I have to do it more, I have to do it more, I have to do it more.
Right.
I've noticed that especially men, because they are taught generally to be efficient and to really, put themselves into it, they would just start to do and do and do and do. And it doesn't matter how many times you ask, have you sent the shipment, if the ships aren't going anywhere, But there was this maladaptive, this definitely maladaptive, it serves no purpose, It's torturing them, it's breaking up relationships with colleagues in the office all over the world. If this is a boss who's now yelling at someone because basically, they are not doing it enough, it's like, dude, it's not working, right? So basically, you're going to have that. And when it comes to getting out of that, it's scary, right? It's very, very scary, because this is something that gives you this feeling of control, right? And I think something very similar can actually definitely be noticed with all the biases and prejudices, because our cultures include them. Our cultures will always include them. I have a bunch of theories, many of them completely and utterly unwritten yet, because this is long-term work about how this started, how it continued. But again, I'm not going to go into that, because we'll be here until the cows come home and we don't have any hay. So what I am going to say is the reason we actually stop being adaptive is because the group becomes the more important thing. And I think that's always down to how stressed we feel, how endangered we feel. And, that can be imagined or real. Mm-hmm. And because group is important, and obviously fine, this starts with self, continues with friends and family, people that basically help us survive. We're group creatures. This dependence on the group can actually lead to the point where, upon meeting a saber-toothed tiger, we no longer ask ourselves, shall we climb a tree? We ask ourselves, are people I kind of care about going to be angry if I climb the tree? Okay. And this is where this argument, this actually really ties back to what we were discussing in a way, that a lot of the times we learn culture, including bad things, from people that we love, that we trust, or that we wanted to love and trust, because obviously not all families are going to be supportive, not always going to be good families. So there's always this feeling of, but if I belong to this group, how do I respond? And again, that in itself by default is a maladaptive response. You're not asking yourself, is the situation actually a problem? You're asking yourself, what should I think? And that is so dangerous, actually, right. Including just from personal safety, from right. that perspective.
Yeah. I think that whole thing sort of sums it up perfectly in the way that people react with these hard conversations. Is when your normative reality is threatened, it can be so isolating, because you think about what other people think about you, and how absolutely. That affects your position in society or in your family. That can be really hard. And obviously that makes total sense if there's a possibility that your personal safety is going to be threatened if you dissent or whatnot. But I think in terms of people trying to do the work to change, we've said this throughout the episode, but empathy and context and honesty are huge. When analyzing yourself, when analyzing the interactions between others, with having those conversations about relationships, it can be really beneficial to lead with that.
Also knowing where something comes from, right? Knowing where something comes from. And this is obviously why I initially did archaeology and anthropology as a degree, because ultimately I wanted to see history in a very kind of forensic sense, so we say, in material culture, know what we can actually glean, what we can. And obviously that in itself can help, because a lot of beliefs we hold, for instance, are also down to a specific point in time. And then, time goes on, we find more stuff, and that can actually be incredibly, incredibly useful in these conversations.
Yeah. I think overall, it's just finding ways to critique human connectedness, not in a way that's negative or demeaning, but in a way that benefits people and understands that we are all in the same field in terms of our relations as humans. We are all human beings, whether or not that is necessarily recognized under whomever. I think when dealing with these bigger situations such as human rights, that is huge. And just finally, I think I think you'd agree with me on this, that our final three words in the way that we've discussed all of this stuff is context, empathy, and honesty, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You got it right there.
The three tools, calling back to the beginning, where we use to have these conversations. And I think that is really helpful in people trying to do the work, or people who are uncomfortable doing the work but are still doing it, which is a very commendable thing.
I think that is literally it. I mean, it's not, there's so many ways you can approach this. And, it's like a topic you could actually spend for years probably, but not just a podcast episode. But ultimately it is about understanding that this is not about hate. It's not about destroying anybody or anybody's identity. This is just simply about being able to have the space to recognize that you are safe to think of other people as people.
Mic drop. I'll just end it right there. That's great. I love that. I think that's the best way we could end this, So Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. I really appreciate it. You and I could talk for hours, but
We totally should. We should sit down with a cup of coffee or whatever and
I'll fly
talk
over.
more.
Thank you so much for coming on here and indulging in all my questions. I really appreciate it. So
thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everybody who's been involved with this podcast. This has been a huge honor, and I'm so happy that I can just share a little bit, and I hope this was useful.
Yeah.
And I'm not doing too weird and confused.
No, I think it is.
Thank you for listening to Thick Descriptions Elephant in the Room Unboxed. Want to learn more about us, what we're doing to disrupt traditional educational methods? Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok. thickdescriptions.org 405-397-0584.